Giants, witches, old gods and new, sex, lust, infidelity, more sex, kings, pretenders, murder, intrigue, disloyalty. I could be talking about Game of Thrones, couldn't I? But in fact, I'm talking about two books of the Bible, 1 and 2 Samuel, which we have just reached in reading the Bible in a year. These two books, and they're actually really one book, they were just so long that they couldn't fit them on one scroll. These books are two of the most surprising and intriguing books in the Bible, I think. And when we read them, we'll find that we already know lots of the stories and the content. Some of the most famous stories in the Bible, like David and Goliath, are in its pages. What is the book about, though? Well, in a very simple sense, it's a history. It continues the history of the people of God that began in Joshua. And we talked in another video about the Deuteronomistic history that takes God's people from Joshua right through to the end of Kings and the Babylonian exile. And this Samuel picks up the story from the end of Judges. God's people have entered the promised land under Joshua and things went well, seemingly, but then they spiral down and down. We get the civil disobedience and the violence and everything else that makes Judges such a difficult read. And we open its pages with God's people once more crying out for help, and God raises up the prophet Samuel to help lead the people and to speak to them in the name of God. Now, some of us might be turned off by the idea of just boring old history, but as we will soon see, this is history of the kind that's not usually taught in most schools. And it is both a history, but it's also a lot of theology about who God is and who God's people are meant to be. Now, how Samuel came together is again another one of those intriguing questions that we don't really know all the answers to. But like other books, it seems to have come together over a number of years, and originally was composed from a number of different sources. And occasionally we can see those sources. So people think, for example, that there were a group of stories about the Ark of the Covenant, which we'll read a lot about in the opening chapters. And these came together and were edited together probably again after the Babylonian exile. And we can see that sort of coming together of the different sources by the fact that Samuel doesn't always speak with one voice. And the best example of what I'm trying to say is the question of kings and kingship and monarchy. Because the book of Samuel and the Bible generally really cannot make up its mind what it really thinks about kings. Now, on the one hand, we have Samuel opening the book by warning God's people and saying, you don't want kings. Remember what Moses told you. You don't want kings. They will do all sorts of terrible things and they'll be awful people. And the book goes on to prove Samuel right, because it records all the bad things that happened and incidents like David and Bathsheba and all the trouble with David's sons. But it also records lots of good things about kings. And it records these days, the days of David and Solomon, the days of empire and Israel winning all its military battles, as the glory days of Israel. And they were days that later people would look back to as a sort of golden age. So the final editor of Samuel has brought together these disparate voices and put them into one book. And that makes it very interesting to read. And sometimes we read within a few chapters both praise for kings and condemnation of kings. So watch out for that and see how the writers struggle to know exactly what they are meant to be saying on this subject. We also have important concepts like dealing with the increasingly important role of the temple, questions about worship and how God should be worshipped, We're introduced to the great prophet Samuel, who after Moses is the next great prophet in the history of Israel, and who speaks and acts like a proper Old Testament prophet, even from beyond the grave, as you will see at the end of 1 Samuel. And there's an increasing understanding of how prophets are meant to function, and a question about what it means to have a prophetic voice and to speak truth to power. And that becomes really important with King David and Nathan the prophet. There's also a really intriguing idea about what it means to be human. And in the books of the law, it can be all quite theoretical. Lots of lists, as we saw, about this is how you should live and this is what you should do. But in Samuel, as Americans might say, the tire hits the road. What do you do when you fall in love with the wrong person, somebody else's wife? How do you cope when the family falls apart? How do you cope when you're trying to run a kingdom and be a good and faithful servant of God? And when I was leading a Bible study once on Samuel, I had a social worker in the group, and after we'd read it, she said, well, there's nothing new under the sun. And there's a real humanity in Samuel, where we see all the things that go wrong in our society today. And there's a really intriguing question about how we engage with those stories and what they speak to, how they speak to us today, and what guidance they give, and how they speak to us about how people interact with God and God's law and how it works out in practice. Perhaps most importantly, though, if you are losing the will to live with all the battles and kings and everything else, remember how important these stories are for understanding who Jesus is. At Christmas time, we will sing umpteen times, once in royal David's city. And in the Gospels, there's so many references to David and Jesus being hailed as son of David. What does that mean? Well, unless we have read Samuel and have understood who David was and what he did, then we can't really understand what that was all about. And in particular, we might understand why people wanted Jesus to be like David, but not quite like David. They wanted Jesus to be the David who was meant to be. And one of the wonderful aspects, I think, of 1 and 2 Samuel is that character of David, which is such a complex character, because here we have somebody who knows what he should be doing. He knows the right, but can't quite do it. And in Jesus, we see the fulfillment of the David who was meant to be, arguably. And so we can understand why people hailed Jesus as son of David and the fulfillment of that prophecy that was given in the books and the pages of Samuel. So I really hope that you enjoy this biblical chess game, this biblical Game of Thrones, that you can enjoy some of the characters we meet in the stories and be touched by some of them, those really emotive and challenging stories, like the rejection of King Saul, for example, that it would be good to talk about, and what that says to us about God and about ourselves. So enjoy this story, enjoy the passages, and I look forward very much to discussing them with you before too long.